Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm, my name is Elliot Stone. I'm fortunate enough to be the president of the Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU. Welcome to everybody for joining us. How about this? Is that better? Okay. Welcome. My name's Elliot Stone. We are all here to kick off the Jewish American Heritage Month. And in this case, the program today with Professor Whitfield and from Brandeis and our own Marcia Zerivitz, our founding director. I don't know if you get the title emeritus. I mean, it's bigger than just founding director. But we're very fortunate. This program is about the outsized impact in entertainment of our Jewish population. I find that to be pretty representative of everything else that we do, and in particular with this museum. As you may or may not be aware, Jewish American Heritage Month was a mission that Marcia started with the museum to get passed in Congress with our own Congresswoman Schultz, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Okay, what's really awful about that is she went to college with my wife, so it's just, I apologize. So this little museum helped create in just 2006 Jewish American Heritage Month. And so this outsized impact that we have continues today in so many fields. So this is just an example of what people who have a strong will and a desire can achieve. And so again, thank you all for attending and for supporting the museum. We appreciate all of it. Welcome.
Shalom, welcome everyone. I'm Marcia. Especially good to be back at the microphone. And again, thank you for joining us for the 8th Jewish American Heritage Month. There are tens of thousands of Jews who have made significant contributions to the fabric of American history, culture, and society. Many know of important Jews in the areas of education, business, law, politics, entertainment, arts, philanthropy, medicine, sports, science, military, and much more. But few realize the impact of our people collectively on the quality of life of our country. 10 years ago, as Elliot said, when I worked with our state legislators, particularly Senator Margolis and Representative Gus Guerrero, to get a designated Florida Jewish History Month, I was astounded to learn there was no national month, as other ethnic groups have, to celebrate what Jews have accomplished. So that was the entrance of Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz. In April of 2005, our museum honored her with the Glass Ceiling Award as the first Jewish woman in Florida to be elected to the United States Congress. During our conversation, I asked Debbie, and she agreed, to sponsor federal legislation creating a Jewish American Heritage Month, which we call JMOF. Immediately, the Jewish Museum of Florida and the Community Relations Council of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation collaborated to draft the proposed legislation. That means Judy Gilbert-Gould and myself working with the staff of Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Pepe Janae of Broward County Federation joined us to network with our colleagues around the entire country and within our constituencies to encourage all the Congresspeople to join Debbie. That was real advocacy in action. And Debbie did it. On December the 14th of 2005, a brand new Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz from the 20th District brought up a resolution in the United States House of Representatives that passed by a vote of 423 to 0. I mean, this was unbelievable. Urging President George W. Bush to proclaim each year a designated month for us. Senator Arlen Specter led the same effort in the Senate in February of 2006, and the rest is now history. Again, with the boost of advocacy of many of you in this room, thank you, because you were involved in contacting the President to urge his signing of the proclamation, which he did in April 2006, that each May would be Jewish American Heritage Month. The national announcement was made right here in this museum. So again, we're very, very proud. Why is Jewish American Heritage Month important? JM, as we affectionately call it, is a nationwide celebration of the contributions of Jews to American life, thanks to the opportunities that religious freedom and tolerance have made possible for all Americans. The foundation of our country is built upon the strengths of our unique cultures and backgrounds. Yet, while our diversity is America's strength, ignorance and intolerance about Jewish culture, traditions, and accomplishments are still prevalent throughout the country. Jews make up only 2% of our nation's population, as you know, but have been major contributing members of American society for at least 350 years. And I think, and now there are many more scholars that are agreeing with me, that perhaps even since the 1500s, right here in Florida. Another lecture. Education and awareness about American Jews are the best ways to increase tolerance and understanding and decrease anti-Semitism. I hope you agree about that. Since 2006, JAM programs have taken place across the country. This is what's so exciting. It started here, and it's in every community. In Washington, D.C. alone, the Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration, National Endowment for the Humanities, National Gallery of Art, National Park Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have each joined in raising national consciousness about the contributions of Jewish Americans to our country's heritage. Communities all across the country this month are presenting programs just like ours today to celebrate American Jewish achievements. In the past 3 years, 2010, 2011, and 2012, President Obama has had a very prestigious White House reception to which I was invited. Unfortunately, because of the sequester, there's not going to be one this year, but we are having an event in Washington to muster everyone together. In 2010, you might recall this, astronaut Garrett Reisman got involved. In May of that year, he carried the original 2006 proclamation signed by President George Bush into space. Took it 5 million miles with 186 orbits around the Earth on the space shuttle Atlantis from South Florida to the International Space Station and back. And then in August of that year, in 2010, presented it back to me as a representative of our museum to the new, brand new, National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. In fact, it was the very first event in that museum. Perhaps some of you have been there. This year, we want to thank our major benefactors, Empire Kosher Poultry, Zerivitz Products, and A&E's The Biography Bio Channel for their support, and we are seeking more major sponsors. I'm putting a plug in if anyone here wants to join. The President's Proclamation is right here on the easel. That was sent out on May the 1st, as the President does every year, declaring the month. The Biography Channel will feature profiles of well-known Jewish personalities throughout the month of May as part of the Bio Classroom series. Please check your TV schedules. And there is a national writing contest this year created by the Jewish American Hall of Fame and the Jewish Week publication. High school students throughout the country are being invited to prepare an essay on the topic, which Jewish American do you most admire and why? If you know someone that would be interested, or for high school and junior high school students, please check our website, which is www.jahm.us. Our theme this year is American Jews in Entertainment, and I'll shortly tell you more about that. Just as I said when we opened the Bonin exhibit here in 2006, that Florida would be mostly swampland without the ingenuity and creativity of Jewish developers and builders. We cannot imagine what entertainment in America would be without the Jews, and you're going to hear about that very shortly. I hope you agree that this is appropriate and timely, that we have a designated month to celebrate American Jewish history. The representatives of our two sponsoring federations.
Thank you, Marcia, Joe, and thank you for everything you've done on behalf of the Jewish community, not only Miami-Dade, but throughout the United States. I'm Carol Return. I'm on the program. I'm here to bring you greetings on behalf of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation and its Jewish Community Relations Council. Why am I here on behalf of the Jewish Community Relations Council? Because the JCRC is a department of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, and we are the public policy and advocacy arm of the Federation. So what does that mean? It means that we educate and engage and mobilize the community in pursuit of social justice. And social justice ranges from identifying and combating anti-Semitism and prejudice. It involves protecting civil rights and human rights for Jews and non-Jews alike. It means ensuring the safety and security of Jews worldwide, wherever they may live, including, of course, our beloved homeland of Israel. And key to be able to pursue our mission is working with 15 national agencies, all 4 streams of Judaism, partner agencies, members of our community, like Eli Gantz I see sitting in the back, who is on our JCRC, and people, quite frankly, like yourselves. And it's because of our mission and because of our partnerships, we were honored to be working hand in hand. My predecessor, Marcia Jo already mentioned her, Judy Gilbert-Gould, and Marcia, and Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, to be part of the effort to bring an American Jewish Heritage Month to this state and to this country. And so it's truly a pleasure for us to be co-sponsoring this program, as we have every year, to be working hand in hand with the museum, to be working hand in hand with all of you in the community, as part of the JCRC, as part of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Thank you again for all that you do, and let me ask to come to the podium to join me, another co-sponsor, my colleague, Bruce Udowitz from the Broward Federation.
I'm really proud to be here on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Broward County and of the Jewish community of Broward County. Who would have thought that some almost 30 years ago, a project of one of our JCCs to begin the collection of a little history exhibit of the Jews in Florida would turn into a museum and a national month of celebration of the Jewish American heritage and all kinds of wonderful things that have come as a result of that through the hard work of all of you, certainly of Marcia, and Joanne, and Elliot, and all of his predecessors as president. I want to say that I'm really delighted that we are able to celebrate here and to hear about not only the contributions, and we shouldn't forget this, not only the contributions of Jewish Americans to making America great, but the real impact that America has had on what kind of Jewish life and the kind of Jewish civilization we've been able to live. And so, again, on behalf of Eric Stillman, who's the President and CEO of the Federation, and Laura Goldblum, who is the board chair, I want to thank you for enabling us to be part of this event and to wish you much success as we go forward through the whole month celebrating our contribution to this society. Thank you.
No? Yes. As I mentioned, Jewish American Heritage Month has been a national observance since enacted by the 109th Congress and first announced here at the Jewish Museum of Florida in 2006. And as I mentioned, each year we feature one aspect of the myriads of contributions of American Jews to the fabric of American life. This year, the theme is the American Jews in entertainment. A long and provocative discussion has been going on in America. The historical relationship between the nation's Jews and its entertainment media. The topic includes Jews as creators of media institutions, Jews as individual performers, Jews as producers of entertainment, and Jews as its subject. In the years before the Civil War, when there were only about 150,000 Jews in the United States, entertainment existed primarily in the form of variety theaters, the Wild West, and minstrel shows, which are rough and crude and often denigrating and stereotyping to minority groups. By the 1880s, when about 2 million Jewish immigrants were arriving from Eastern Europe, the Industrial Revolution had changed the once rural face of America. Half of the population had shifted from the farms to towns and cities, with jobs that provided a little spare cash and weekly leisure time for the first time. These people wanted more refined, respectable, and affordable entertainment on a regular basis. Most variety shows were too coarse for women and children to attend, and minstrel shows were already declining in popularity. In a world where phonographs, film, radio, and television did not yet exist, vaudeville filled the gap until about 1932. Each performance was made up of a series of separate, unrelated acts grouped together on a common bill, and usually were tailored to specific audiences of the neighborhood. For Jews, this evolved into the Yiddish theater. Sophie Tucker was one of those stars of the Yiddish theater. She was born as Sonia Kalish in Poland in 1884. She was funny and risque and full of life, but she could also evoke tears, with My Yiddish Mama, which became her trademark. Recordings of that song, which had the power to evoke a reverence for Jewish culture, were so powerful that they were ordered smashed in Germany after Hitler gained power. Sophie was belting songs at age 10, and by age 25 she was in the Ziegfeld Follies. She quickly became one of the top stars in vaudeville, billing herself as the last of the red hot mamas, and continued performing into the 1960s. Many of the early Jewish entertainers were comics, with the ability to laugh at themselves and at Jewish customs. This was clean entertainment, no swear or shocking words, how refreshing compared to some of the language used today. Most were part of the Borscht Belt entertainment that started in the early 1920s in the Catskill Mountains. This was New York's first purpose-built Yiddish theater, the Grand Street Music Hall. Beginning in 1882 and throughout the 1880s and 1990s, amateur theater productions presented Yiddish theater in New York City, leading to regular weekend performances at theaters such as the Bowery Garden, the National, and the Thalia, with unknowns who emerged as stars. Yiddish theater flourished, so that between 1890 and 1940, there were more than 200 Yiddish theaters or touring Yiddish theater troupes in the United States. American Yiddish theater is said to have had two artistic golden ages, the first in the 19th century and the second in the political and artistic plays written and performed in the 1920s. The Tomaszewskis were the most celebrated of the Yiddish theater impresarios. Of course, you're familiar with that name because we know the grandson, Michael Tilson Thomas, of the New World Symphony right here on Miami Beach. In 1881, 12-year-old Boris Tomaszewski arrived in New York City from a shtetl in the Ukraine. With his beautiful voice, young Boris earned money by singing on Shabbos at the Henry Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. During the week, he worked as a cigarette maker in a sweatshop, where he heard his fellow workers sing songs from the Yiddish theater they had enjoyed in the old country. From this exposure in the sweatshops, Boris had a goal of bringing Yiddish theater to America. During his early performance, when a female lead did not sing, Boris played her part and his career was launched at the age of 13. He became a producer and director of the company at a really young age and toured the United States. In 1887, his company played in Baltimore, where 14-year-old Bessie Whitfield Kaufman was in the audience. Bessie was enchanted by the female star's performance. Her hair was piled high with ringlets, Bessie recalled, and she had all this sparkling jewelry. She was the center of attention and flirting, and all the men were watching her. Bessie made her way backstage to meet the Shayna Mela, who turned out to be Boris Tomaszewski. Many of you know the story. Bessie joined the company and in 1891 married Boris and took over from him the female leads. Yiddish theaters range from high schools to larger purpose-built facilities like the 3,000-seat Thalia Theater. This was one of 4 major Yiddish theaters that presented 1,100 performances annually during the turn of the 20th century for an estimated audience of over 2 million. Volksbein, which is Yiddish for the People's Stage, was founded in 1915 on New York City's Lower East Side and is thought to be New York's oldest theater company, English or Yiddish. This area is considered to be the height of Yiddish theater. At the time, there were 15 Yiddish theater companies in New York and many more worldwide. Due to the destruction of European jewelry by the Nazis, the Volksbein is one of only 5 professional Yiddish theaters still in operation today, and they have been in existence for 90 years. Also in New York is the New Yiddish Rep, and the others are in Bucharest, Warsaw, and Tel Aviv. Molly Pecan, born Margaret Paikun, was a star in Yiddish theater and film, but in time she turned to English language productions. The First Lady of the musical stage was introduced to American audiences in 1923 as the greatest sensation from Europe, even though she was born in New York City in 1898. This little yenta with the big expressive eyes entertained theater, radio, TV, and film audiences for over 7 decades. She started when she was 6 years old with her song and dance routines, while helping to popularize the Yiddish culture into the American mainstream as well as overseas. Molly died in 1992. She was among so many others who performed here on Miami Beach. Here's what the Cinema Theater in South Beach, right in this neighborhood, looked like in the early 1970s when it was being used for Yiddish theater and vaudeville. The cinema was originally a casino supper club, later converted into a film theater, and then it became a nightclub. The population of Jewish elderly, as well as the Yiddish theater, were obliterated in 1980 when the criminal element of the Mariel boatlift people arrived on South Beach. But the Yiddish theater remained highly influential on what is still known as Jewish humor. Several of America's most influential 20th century acting teachers had their first taste of theater in Yiddish. Though some of the methods they developed were reactions to the often melodramatic and larger-than-life style of Yiddish theater, this style nonetheless informed their theories and left its stamp on them. Austro-Hungarian immigrant Lee Strasberg is considered the father of method acting in America. In 1951, he became director of the Actors Studio in New York, considered the nation's most prestigious acting school. In 1969, he founded the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute in New York and in Hollywood to teach the work he pioneered. As an actor, Strasberg is probably best known for his role as gangster Hyman Roth, based on Meyer Lansky of fame here, that went to synagogue here in this building, in The Godfather Part 2, 1974, which earned him a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Stella Adler was a Yiddish theater actress and an acclaimed acting teacher who founded studios in both New York and LA, which produced alumni including Marlon Brando, Robert De Niro, Warren Beatty, Melanie Griffith, Martin Sheen, Anthony Quinn, and on and on. Although its glory days have passed, Yiddish theater companies still perform in various Jewish communities. The Mount Hebron Cemetery in Flushing, New York, was established in 1909 and has a section for people who work in the Yiddish theater industry, including the Thomas Jeffersons, who are buried there. In June of 1905, a Pittsburgh show business entrepreneur remodeled a storefront as a movie picture theater and offered continuous performances from 8 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. Within 18 months, the Nickelodeons were a sociological phenomenon, and Yiddish theaters were badly hurt. 60% of the theaters in New York were owned by Jews, at a time when Jews were 25% of the population. Particularly popular on New York's Lower East Side, by 1908, there were 325 movie theaters in New York, mostly small, with less than 300 seats, and mostly where 500,000 immigrant Jews lived. In the audience were garment merchants who became the founding fathers of movies in Hollywood, like Marcus Loew, Adolf Zucker, and William Fox. A Jew, Sigmund Lubin, erected the first building to be used as a cinema in 1899. The admission was 10 cents, which was considered high for that time. Sigmund Lubin came from Germany and in the 1890s was creating, distributing, and exhibiting hundreds of short, silent films from his studios in the Philadelphia suburbs. By 1910, he was producing longer films, most notably The Battle of Gettysburg. Soon after, his career as a pioneer of American movies was eclipsed by the founders of Hollywood studios. In 1914, laws changed to allow 600 seats. This is the Sunshine Theater on your left, which opened in 1917, and on the right is the announcement for the reopening of this building, which is now state-of-the-art and an historic building, which was reopened in 2001. Gilbert Bronco Billy Anderson, born as Maxwell Henry Aronson, is best known as the first star of the Western film genre. In the 12-minute-long 1903 motion picture The Great Train Robbery, Anderson played 3 roles and then began to write, direct, and act in his own westerns. Anderson was honored posthumously in 1998 with his image on a U.S. postage stamp. In 2002, he was inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame. For the past 9 years, Niles, California, has held an annual Bronco Billy Silent Film Festival, and there is a Bronco Billy Park in Chicago. Thea Barrow, born as Theodosia Goodman, was an American silent film and stage actress. Barrow was one of the most popular actresses of the silent era and one of cinema's earliest sex symbols. And one of her femme fatale roles earned her the nickname The Band. Her only surviving film footage is from her 1917 epic movie, Cleopatra. This was the one before Elizabeth. Those who made the movies great and became the heads of our major movie studios were Carl Laemmle, founder of Universal Pictures, William Fox, who founded 20th Century Fox, Adolf Zucker, who founded Paramount, Louis B. Mayer and Samuel Goldwyn, who founded together Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM, and Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures. In other words, all of the studios were founded by Jews. These men did not invent movies. I don't want to stretch it that far. That distinction goes to Thomas Edison. What was remarkable about these Jewish immigrants from Europe was that they founded these movie studios and that it was their ability to recognize the new medium when it first came into use shortly after their arrival in the country. It was they who made the movie industry big business, not only because they were personally involved in studio production, but also because they invented a means of distributing them. The first major Hollywood movie production company was Universal, as I mentioned, founded in 1912 by German immigrant Carl Laemmle, who emigrated in 1884. Regarded as one of the most important of the early film pioneers, he produced or was otherwise involved in more than 400 films. The second and third Hollywood movie production companies were Fox in 1915 and Paramount by Zucker in 1960. In 1915, Hungarian immigrant William Fuchs, who changed his name to William Fox, started Fox Film Corporation, which became 20th Century Fox. He actually has a great-granddaughter, Susan Fox, who lives here in Miami. I don't know if Susan is here today. I talked to her. But anyway, she lives right here in Miami. Hungarian immigrant Adolf Zucker had become wealthy by 1903 when his cousin approached him for a loan to expand the chain of movie theaters. Zucker insisted on forming a partnership to open another one. Incidentally, another partner in that venture was Marcus Lowe. In 1912, Adolf Zucker established a film studio that in 1916 evolved into Paramount Studios, of which he served as president or chairman until his death. He revolutionized the film industry mostly because he organized production, distribution, and exhibition within a single company. And Warner Brothers, one of the most respected, diversified, and successful motion picture and television studios in the world, began when brothers Albert, Sam, Harry, and Jack incorporated their fledgling movie company in 1923. In 1927, the release of the world's first talkie, a jazz singer, set a character and tone of innovation and influence that would become synonymous with Warner Brothers. And as Al Jolson foretold in this milestone movie, you ain't heard nothing yet. The Warners brought sound to movies, introduced the first four-legged star, revitalized the movie musical, created the gangster picture era, and produced a number of socially significant films that evoked national awareness about growing problems of their times. Today, the vast Warner Brothers library, one of the most prestigious and valuable in the world, consists of more than 61,000 hours of programming, including nearly 6,500 feature films and 3,000 television programs comprised of tens of thousands of individual episodes. The jazz singer by Al Jolson. Steve, you're going to talk about, I'm going to skip over this. Steve will get more into Al Jolson. That's his specialty. The Jewish movie moguls understood the need for making movies which were reflections of American culture. That is the reason why they invented the so-called Western, which always carried the message then and now that crime does not pay. These Jewish movie studio owners invented talking movies, Technicolor, and musicals. For 40 years, from 1920 until 1960, the movie industry was at its height. From romances to crime stories and the inevitable Westerns, the Jewish movie bosses produced everything imaginable, except their films did not include Jewish themes. Nor were they willing, during the Second World War, to mention the persecution of their own families left behind in Eastern Europe. In an exhibit at the Jewish Museum in New York on this topic in 2003, the text stated, "It is to the eternal shame of these powerful men that they sympathize with everyone from Native Americans to the Aborigines of Australia, but never their fellow Jews." We should recall that there were and are innumerable Jewish producers and directors, many of whom changed their names in order to escape recognition as Jews. This was also true of numerous Jewish movie actors. If you've ever seen a movie with Kirk Douglas, you would have really watched a performance by Isser Danielovich Dembski. Winona Ryder was born Laura Horowitz, and the comedian Red Buttons was called Aaron Schwartz. Erwin Nyberg was known for many years, interviewing celebrities on TV every night as Alan King. There is even an Albert Einstein in the acting profession. He is known as Albert Brooks. Bob Dylan was bar mitzvahed as Robert Zimmerman. Betty Persky, the cousin of the former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, became Lauren Bacall. And of course, these are just a very few examples, and we love to talk about the Jews that people don't know are Jews. Public radio broadcasting began in the 1920s. By 1922, approximately 3 million households had radios. By 1930, about 46%. By 1940, 81%. And the industry was created and driven by Jews, especially David Sarnoff of NBC. David Sarnoff was an immigrant from Belarus in 1900. He spent much of his early childhood in a Heder, studying and memorizing the Torah. He ruled over an ever-growing telecommunications and consumer electronics empire that included RCA and its founding in 1919. RCA founded NBC in 1926. Sarnoff led the company into TV broadcasting and headed NBC until 1970. Much of the radio production was focused in New York City, providing many Jewish writers and performers unprecedented access to a public forum. Radio-enabled performers such as Jack Benny, George Burns, Fanny Bryce, Ed Wynn, and Eddie Cantor, along with many of their Jewish writers. There were landmark Jewish radio series, including The Goldbergs, AB's Irish Rose, The Eternal Light, and Americans All, Immigrants All. Do you remember those? No one here is old enough, right? Gertrude Berg's career spanned 35 years. She was the most popular and easily recognizable icon of the Jewish matriarch in the American popular imagination. Her show portrayed American Jewish life to America. In the beginning, this was a great concern, being so ethnic, but America embraced the show when it was premiered in 1929, sponsored by Pepsodent toothpaste. Berg wrote, produced, and was the star. The show evolved from a daily radio show to a 1948 Broadway play, to a feature film, to a TV show called The Goldbergs that ran from 1949 to 1956. Berg attributed the show's success to Molly, Jake, Rosalie, and Sammy, those were the family names, presenting real problems with which listeners, as ordinary people, were familiar. In the history of 20th century American entertainment, there is perhaps no equivalent figure who has incorporated such a range of abilities or achieved such continued success, all the time just being a Jewish mother. Jews did not invent TV. That was an invention of Philo Farnsworth, who, believe it or not, at age 14, invented television. This changed the world, and the Jewish contribution to that development brought television into every home. Remember, RCA is a Jewish-founded company. In America, television became commercially available in the late 1930s and widely accessible in American homes in the 1940s and 1950s. Jews were the founding titans of the three major American television networks: William Paley at CBS, David Sarnoff at NBC, and Leonard Goldenson at ABC. Paley was at the helm of CBS for 60 years, 60, and brought broadcast programming to affiliate stations. Goldenson, who incidentally lived in Sarasota, Florida, brought Paramount Studios out of bankruptcy and into TV, bought ABC in 1953 for $24.5 million, and 30 years later, it was worth $3.5 billion. Probably Goldenson is best known for starting Monday Night Football, Norman, Olympic coverage, movies made for TV, and the miniseries. From the start, Jews played a prominent role in the TV industry. In addition to producing television shows and starring in them, Jewish characters appeared in the small screen as well. The variety show was one of the first venues for live entertainment on television, and many contributors to these shows in the 50s and 60s were Jewish comedians. Remember Uncle Milty Berle at NBC's Texaco Star Theater, and Sid Caesar at NBC's Show of Shows, which was on air from 1950 to 1954, and writers like Woody Allen, Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, Phil Silvers, and Neil Simon brought Jewish humor into the mainstream, combining traditional Yiddishisms with physical comedy. After the Goldbergs went off the air in 1956, few shows had Jewish characters, and none covered explicitly Jewish topics. In the 1970s, as particularism became less taboo, series about African-American families gained popularity, and other television shows explored Jewish topics more explicitly. One of the most popular Jewish characters on TV was Rhoda Morgenstern from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and the eventual spin-off Rhoda in 1974. Valerie Harper made her Rhoda Judaism explicit, but also projected many negative stereotypes, like always worrying about her weight and being neurotic about men. In the 1980s, Jewish characters were few and far between, and the decade did not yield very many memorable TV shows with Jewish themes. All that changed in the 1990s thanks to the observational comedy of Jerry Seinfeld, best known for playing a semi-fictional version of himself in the sitcom Seinfeld, which he co-created with Larry David, another Jew. Seinfeld revolutionized the way Jews were portrayed on TV, unabashedly focusing entire episodes on Jewish themes, from attending a bris to dealing with crazy Jewish parents. If the 1990s saw an upsurge of Jewish characters on television, the 2000s realized the normalization of Judaism on television. More and more shows feature Jewish characters, but shows made less of a big deal about their Judaism. Characters like Larry David on Curb Your Enthusiasm, Sarah Silverman on the Sarah Silverman program, and Ari Gold on Entourage took the reins from Seinfeld's Jerry, Elaine, and George. As Jewish characters and themes proliferated, Jewishness on television has become less of a novelty. This trend is most apparent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, the satirical nightly news show where the unashamed secular Jew, Stewart, rants about the day's events. He makes references to Judaism or Yiddishisms, bringing formerly Jewish inside jokes into mainstream culture. We know of so many Jewish producers and writers. As I said earlier, Jews now comprise about 2% of the nation's population, yet today about 2/3 of leading TV and movie producers are estimated to be Jewish. And thus the impact of Jews upon the nation's popular culture has been immeasurable. Screenwriters Guild is a national unit of writers working in motion pictures, television, and radio. A former Harvard debater and law student, Chris Kaiser is a producer and writer of TV shows, including Sisters and Party of Five, for which he won a Golden Globe, and is current president of the Writers Guild of America. This topic can be a full lecture by itself. Think Irving Berlin, widely considered one of the greatest American songwriters who wrote and composed God Bless America. In January of this year, PBS presented a special called Broadway Musicals, A Jewish Legacy. Did anyone see that? It's a great show, right? It told the story of the phenomenon of how American Jewish songwriters created a uniquely American art form. Monty Python's Spamalot features a song with these lyrics. And I can't sing, so I'm going to say it. In any adventure, if you don't want to lose, you won't succeed on Broadway if you don't have any Jews. When I was 6 years old, I saw Carousel on Broadway. Last weekend, I watched live from Lincoln Center present Carousel on television. Songs like When You Walk Through a Storm are just as vibrant, just as entertaining and emotional as they were when first introduced on Broadway in 1945. Don't you agree? Oscar Hammerstein's first Broadway show was in 1921. Over 40 years, he won 8 Tony Awards and 2 Academy Awards for Best Original Song. Many of his songs are standard repertoire for singers and jazz musicians. He co-wrote 850 songs. Richard Rodgers composed more than 900 songs and 43 Broadway musicals. I mean, those numbers are staggering. He also composed music for films and television. Rodgers was the first person to win what are considered the top show business awards in television, recording, movies, and Broadway. An Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, now collectively known as an EGOT. He has also won a Pulitzer Prize, making him one of 2 people to receive each award. The other one is another Jew, Marvin Hamlisch. So many other types of performers have been Jews. For example, Hungarian Eric Weitz, known as Harry Houdini, was noted for his sensational escape acts. There was actually a museum for Harry Houdini in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Has anyone been there? And Lou Jacobs was a master clown who performed for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for 60 years. He came to the United States from Germany in 1923. Circus performers have long argued that Lou Jacobs made more people laugh in live performances than anyone else in history. He was the first living person to have his portrait appear on a U.S. postage stamp, living person, in 1966. In 1992, Lou Jacobs died in Sarasota, where he had lived. This is a topic that's going to be covered very shortly by our distinguished keynote speaker. As Jews become more American, America becomes more Jewish. There are more Jewish film festivals today, more Jewish characters on TV and in film. Yiddish words are common on TV. You hear them. Why have Jews played such a predominant role in entertaining America? Using the newest entertainment media, the internet, we can discuss this from our homes with total strangers. We can also discuss this in person this afternoon with a friend of our museum and a most knowledgeable person in this field. To help us answer the question, why the Jews in entertainment, I am proud to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Stephen Whitfield, who has presented here for Jewish American Heritage Month in 2007, and we decided last year or the year before. Dr. Whitfield holds the Max Richter Chair in American Civilization at Brandeis University, where he has taught since 1972, taught also a very long time. A native of Houston who grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, we're proud to say, he earned a BA from Tulane, a master's degree from Yale, and a doctorate in American history from Brandeis. He has served as visiting professor of American Studies at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, at Catholic universities, and twice at the Sorbonne. He has also served as visiting professor of American Jewish history at the University of Munich. He is the author of 8 books, including most recently In Search of American Jewish Culture, and numerous scholarly articles. Within our theme today, Dr. Whitfield will focus on the movies and comedy. Take it away, break a leg, Steve.
Marcia, thank you for that extraordinarily enthusiastic introduction. It's hard to know how to follow this, but I'm grateful for the invitation to return to the Jewish Museum of Florida. Everybody's able to hear me? Yes, okay, that's great, thank you. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be back here and to try to answer the question that you saw at the very end. But I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to two of the people who are here this afternoon. My friends Sharon and Marty Rothberg, whom I've known now for 53 years as of September. I cherish our abiding friendship. Marty and Sharon were the first people to engineer the first speaking engagement I ever had after my own bar mitzvah, which is when I had a chance to speak here under their auspices at Congregation Beth David. And I do want to thank them again for that opportunity, of course, to return to Miami as well on this occasion. And the striking thing, it seems to me, in watching Marcia's really wonderful and vigorous presentation of the historical research about Jews and entertainment, a couple of things occurred to me that you may perhaps want to think about, and there'll be a chance to talk about this in the question-answer period. One of them has to do with the degree to which Jews, who have never been more than 4% of the American population, which was in the 1930s, now probably around 2% of the American population. Of course, the extraordinary thing is the degree to which there has been an amazing impact in altering American culture. The degree to which, also as Bruce noted, that it's not only what the way America has changed the Jews, but also the way the Jews have changed America. And the degree to which it seems to be the key to the story that Marcia told just now really has to do with that reciprocal relationship in which Jews have been changed as a result of living in the New World, in which America has been changed because Jews were here. And if you think just for a moment about what it took to, for example, be a musician in Tsarist Russia, when Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement, the only way that Jews usually could ever leave the Pale of Settlement was to study music in the Russian city of St. Petersburg. Very rare to be able to do so. This was the only way you could avoid 25 years in the Russian army. The only way that you could live in a city like St. Petersburg rather than the Pale of Settlement. The only way in which you would have opportunities that you would be denied otherwise. To compare that particular limitation with the opportunities that America provided is, of course, perhaps the most striking feature of the story, and the one that I think deserves perhaps the greatest reflection in terms of the ways in which Jews in the United States, so many of whom, roughly 2 million, left that Pale of Settlement, what that really meant in terms of the opportunities that were provided. But the other factor, of course, is that in doing so, they changed America in all sorts of very permanent ways. And the striking thing that I think Marcia's presentation requires us to accept is the extraordinary power and durability and energy of Jewish culture. That despite the tiny numbers of Jews in the United States, there seems to be something about the combination of talent and culture that is truly significant and has remained extraordinarily influential. And permit me to give a short story that will indicate really the power of that culture. And that concerns the institution where I teach, Brandeis University, the only Jewish-sponsored, non-sectarian university in the world. And about a quarter of a century ago, I had a conversation with one of the most interesting students whom I've ever taught, a woman named Ching Hua, who was born in Beijing, raised in Shanghai, and never left the People's Republic of China until she came to Brandeis University. And at the end of her junior year, I ran into Ching and I asked her what she was planning to do for the summer. And she told me she was going to be working in a pizza parlor in the town of Brighton, very near the campus. I thought that would be an interesting way by which she could see at least a certain version of America. Later that summer, I ran into her and I asked her how things were going in the pizza parlor. And she told me that she had to quit. And I asked her why, and she said, "Oh, Professor Whitfield, it was just too much of a schlep." Anyway, that will give you some indication of the power and the durability of the Jewish culture in the United States. And of course, that sense of reciprocity is really, it seems to me, one striking feature of what one can think about in terms of Jewish role in entertainment in the United States. The other factor that Marcia did not have a chance to mention that I think is also worth noting, and that is, if you look at American anti-Semitism in the 20th century, you will be struck by how frequently anti-Semites attacked the Jewish role in entertainment. Whether it be Henry Ford, whether it be Charles Lindbergh, whether it be a number of far less significant figures later, they saw in the Jewish role, particularly in Hollywood, something that was insidious, something that was sinister. And the amazing thing, of course, is that while anti-Semitism has very, very strikingly declined since the era of Henry Ford, and certainly since the era of Charles Lindbergh as well, the amazing thing is there has been no harm, no adversity that has hit the Jewish people, even as the Jewish role, as Marcia clearly noted, even as the Jewish role in American entertainment became more conspicuous. So there's been a kind of paradox here, and that is the moguls, those who ran the major Hollywood studios, were, as she noted, extraordinarily fearful of any conspicuous Jewishness to be associated with their studios or with the movies that they produced and distributed. Nevertheless, even as Jewishness has become more conspicuous, even as Jewishness has become part of American life, there has been absolutely no increase in anti-Semitism as a result of that. So that you might say that the faith in American hospitality, the faith in American tolerance, the faith in American opportunity, has to a remarkable extent been vindicated. And that this is something that has gone on really over the last, really certainly in our lifetimes, as a way of thinking about the paradox here, that the fears that were expressed in the 1920s and 1930s, the fears that were conveyed by the sense that there should be nothing Jewish of any major consequence on the American screen, those fears, it turns out, have not been warranted. And that the amazing thing is that there has been now an extraordinary rise in the conspicuousness of Jewish life in America as presented in American entertainment, while at the same time anti-Semitism is at levels that are barely palpable or recognizable. In any event, that seems to me as a kind of paradox that one might say might be said to emerge from the presentation that Marcia made, and that one might think about in looking at American and the Jewish role in American entertainment. She noted, of course, the role of the moguls, the figures who created the 7 major movie studios, the extent to which these were men who were either immigrants themselves or the sons of immigrants, and that they created an industry that by the 1920s, by 1926, was the 5th largest industry in the United States. And by that year, American movies were 90% of the world's movies. and to an amazing extent, this was something that seemed to come out of nowhere, and that was responsible really for a remarkable degree of alteration, not only in American entertainment, but in world entertainment as well. These were men who were in various ways were the sons of failed fathers. They were men who felt that somehow the world of tradition, the old world itself, was something that needed to be escaped from as rapidly as possible. They were, in a sense, in flight from their Judaism, as well as from the sense of shame and humiliation that they associated with their families and with their fathers in particular. And they were men who, even though tended to have second wives who were non-Jews, nevertheless never crossed over into Christianity itself. And it's fair to say that all of them were, in various degrees, extraordinarily secular, extraordinarily indifferent to, if not downright hostile to, Judaism or to religion in general, and that was reflected in their personal lives to a remarkable degree. Perhaps the most striking case of that was Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures, who was once playing poker with, among others, his brother Jack. Harry Cohn was an extraordinarily irascible and truculent person, and he once challenged, in the course of that poker game, he challenged his brother Jack by asking to see if his brother Jack could recite the Lord's Prayer. Jack began by saying, "Now I lay me down to sleep." Harry Cohn pushed the money that was part of the bet over and said, "That's enough. I didn't know you knew it." This was the world that they themselves inhabited. And it's a world which is most strikingly represented, because Marcia allowed me to talk for a few minutes about Al Jolson, that in some ways is the iconic figure who personified this particular desire above all for assimilation. It's very, very difficult to convey in the year 2013 the impact that Al Jolson had as a performer on a stage. I can only mention a few particular instances, one of which Marcia mentioned in a slightly different context, and that is when various entertainers were going on stage to promote war bonds during the First World War. One of those stage performances was in 1918, actually near the end of the war. The penultimate performer was the great tenor Enrico Caruso. It was downright malicious to have billed Al Jolson to get on stage after Enrico Caruso. But Jolson bolted onto the stage and spontaneously said, "Folks, you ain't heard nothing yet." And then, in various ways, he proceeded to provide something that nobody had ever seen before in terms of what we would now call the status, really, of a superstar. When he opened in a play called Bombo in 1921, there were 37 curtain calls after he had finished the performance of Bombo. He, of course, is the first, when you see him in The Jazz Singer 1927, it's remarkable that he introduces the song for the first time in a sound film of Blue Skies by Irving Berlin. He was a performer who was a kind of kinetic, magnetic performer who was covered by theater critics in terms that were almost scary and chilling, in terms of the emotional impact that Jolson seemed to have upon audiences of his time. One theater critic said it was like there were electric currents under the seats of the theater. There was something almost scary about the capacity that Jolson had to reach emotional depths in the audience that no performer had ever yet achieved. Eddie Cantor, whom everybody knows was an extraordinarily gifted, versatile, talented performer, early in his career is backstage watching Al Jolson perform. And Eddie Cantor, who was no slouch, said, and I quote, "I can't compete with Jolson," end of quote. And Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of the author of The Great Gatsby, even said that Jolson, quote, "is greater than Jesus," end of quote. That was, in a sense, something extraordinary about Jolson's gift as really the first superstar. And yet there's something strange about trying to figure out what his legacy was. He starred in 10 movies, and yet only the first one is the only movie that anybody remembers Jolson was ever in. And that, of course, was the first sound feature film, which was The Jazz Singer. It's probably in some ways, although you may have an argument here, it's in some ways the most important movie ever made in the United States about Jewish life. Because it's obviously about the conflict between an old world of tradition and a new world of opportunity. A conflict involving a performer named Jack Robin, initially Jackie Rabinowitz, played by Al Jolson, who either has to return to the synagogue because his father, the cantor, is dying, and it is up to Jackie Rabinowitz, now known as Jack Robin, to sing Kol Nidre on that night, or he has a chance to open at the Winter Garden and to really launch his significant show business career. That is the conflict that is presented. And for much of the film of The Jazz Singer, it's clear that the character played by Al Jolson has made his choice for assimilation, has made his choice for acculturation, has made his choice for, in a sense, repudiating the world of his fathers, the world of the previous 10 generations of Rabinowitzes who had been cantors, and that now America will offer him a chance for success, for upward mobility, for really transferring whatever he had from the ghetto into the larger world of show business itself. That is how the way it is presented in the film, and the movie, as was realized by a number of European directors when they came to work in Hollywood in the 1920s, is that you can't please American audiences unless you have a happy ending. And the happy ending consists of the fact that the character played by Al Jolson gets to do both. He returns to the synagogue, he sings Kol Nidre, and he's still yet able to go the next night with his mother in the audience to be able to get down on one knee and sing Manning, and of course to star at the Winter Garden in New York, and to clearly launch a significant show business career. So the movie, which was done by the Warner Brothers, was a kind of tribute to the allure, to the enduring power of tradition, while at the same time ensuring that that would not be an impediment to upward mobility. It would not be an impediment to future success in show business. It would indeed be an opportunity for both freedom and spectacular achievement in the world of American entertainment. So it seemed to suggest that in returning to the synagogue for Kol Nidre, it seemed to suggest that Jolson was indeed being loyal to his own origins as the son of somebody who had been a rabbi. But in fact, Jolson was a very lousy role model for his fellow Jews. All 4 of his wives were non-Jews. He in fact always performed on Kol Nidre himself until the gossip columnist Walter Winchell shamed him into ending such habits. When he died, he was buried in a tallis, which he otherwise never wore, in Los Angeles' Temple Israel, which he otherwise never attended. And he was eulogized by George Jessel, whom Jolson detested, as the so-called sweet singer of Israel. And what George Jessel said on the occasion of Al Jolson's funeral in 1950. What he said on that occasion was, Jolson presents the most striking case of a Jew who is happy, who indeed seems to promote the very notion of happiness itself. Jessel got a lot of things wrong with Jolson, but he got that right in the sense that it was not so much that Jolson was a Jew, but that his Americanness came out in the possibilities of the pursuit of happiness. And if one were to think about the anti-Semitic criticism of American movies, it would be largely that what movies did, perhaps more than any other medium, is to suggest the possibility that life might be indeed about pleasure. And in this respect, the anti-Semites were not entirely wrong in fearing that something had changed now within American culture, and that the Christian emphasis upon duty, the Christian concern and fear about the consequences of sin, this was something that Hollywood was in fact undermining. and that what Hollywood did to American culture, more than perhaps any other single movie, was to suggest that life in this world is one that ought to be lived for the sake of pleasure, and not merely for the sake of duty. And that somehow this would be an opportunity, in the only life we have, in the only planet we know, this is something now that is worth pursuing, rather than for the larger stakes of salvation, or redemption, or damnation. So that in that sense, what Al Jolson represented, according to the eulogy delivered by George Jessel, was this sense, in other words, that there was something now that needed to, that consisted of undermining the earlier 19th century and certainly earlier Puritan emphasis upon duty and upon requirements and upon ensuring that one's life is to be lived free of sin. So that H.L. Mencken's famous definition of Puritanism as the sneaking suspicion that someone somewhere may be happy. This is something now that Hollywood was indeed to undermine and to destroy within American life in all sorts of ways. And that Jolson was in some ways the embodiment of that. Jolson's career basically loses its significance from 1927, after the jazz singer itself, until his death in 1950. There are all sorts of ways why his career declines. But he was representative in ways that Marcia also noted, and that is his commitment to assimilation, his commitment to a kind of full Americanization, was something that would indeed characterize the way by which the Jews in the entertainment industry in the 1920s, the 1930s and the 1940s, and perhaps well into the 1950s also represented. There are a number of reasons why this was so. And because assimilationism usually now has a very bad name, because in various ways we have moved beyond the need for assimilation, there may be, at least for a couple of minutes, a chance perhaps to rectify, or at least to understand that particular imbalance. In the 1930s and the 1940s, nobody knew exactly how hospitable America would be. Nobody quite knew how much freedom Jews would have to be not just fully Americans, but also to be fully Jews. Anti-Semitism in America was at its peak in the 1930s, and believe it or not, even during the Second World War, before it undergoes a very sharp decline. And the general view among the Jewish defense agencies was that even to denounce anti-Semitism, even to emphasize the ways by which Jews were in various ways disabled by all sorts of forms of discrimination, even to talk about it would indeed arouse anti-Semitism itself. So generally speaking, the notion of an extremely low profile, the notion that the more inconspicuous Jews would be, the greater their chance of succeeding within American society, that was indeed the view that was widely shared, not merely by the moguls who Marcia mentioned, although that was generally their view, but by the defense agencies themselves. And after the Second World War, 2 films about anti-Semitism were made that broke with that tradition. One of them was done by RKO, which was Crossfire. The second done by 20th Century Fox, which was Gentleman's Agreement. And the amazing thing is that both of those movies faced resistance and even opposition by Jewish defense agencies like the American Jewish Committee, and even to some extent the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, on the grounds that even to show anti-Semitism might indeed bring out anti-Semites themselves. What was there about Jews that generated hostility to them? Maybe there was something to that, and therefore there was the sense, in other words, that this was indeed not doing the Jews a favor by doing films that in fact denounced anti-Semitism. So both of those films look very, very odd from the perspective of 2013. The film that actually won the Oscar for Best Film that year, 1947, was Gentleman's Agreement. And some people in the audience may be old enough to remember that movie. But in 1947, it's a movie in which Gregory Peck plays a Gentile journalist who, in order to see the extent of anti-Semitism, decides to pretend to be Jewish, and he wants to write a magazine series called I Was a Jew for 8 13 weeks, end of quote. And the movie is indeed so thin on the subject of what it means to be a Jew, in which Gregory Peck pretends to be a Jew, that sometimes the meaning was lost. Moss Hart, whose name Marcia put on the board, wrote the script based on Laura Z. Hobson's novel. And after the film was done, Moss Hart runs into one of the technicians who had worked on the film. And the technician goes up to Moss Hart and tells Moss Hart how grateful he is that he did such a movie with a very interesting moral. And Moss Hart asks the technician, what do you think the moral of Gentleman's Agreement was? And the technician replies, from now on, I'm always going to be nice to Jewish people because you can never tell when they'll turn out to be Gentiles. That shows something of the problem with these particular kinds of movies. And you might say that they come to an end in 1960 with the release of Otto Preminger's Exodus. 1960 is a crucial year in all sorts of ways. For the first time, somebody who was not a Protestant is elected president of the United States. Adolf Eichmann is captured in Argentina that year and, in a sense, inaugurates in all sorts of ways the very notion of Holocaust consciousness when he's put on trial in Jerusalem. And in 1960, a movie about the birth of the State of Israel becomes crucial for one key scene in the film, in which the character of Ari Ben Kanan, played by Paul Newman, wants to show the Episcopalian nurse from Indiana, played by Eva Marie Saint, wants to show her the Jezreel Valley. And this would be the scene which would probably end with the two actors clinching and falling in love. And under normal Hollywood circumstances, it would be the Jew who would indeed give up his past in order to be with a Gentile woman. But the striking thing about that particular scene is that even though the character played by Eva Marie Saint, the character's name is Kitty Fremont, says that people are all the same no matter what their past, no matter what their tradition. The character played by Paul Newman basically says, don't believe it. People are different. They have a right to be different. They want to be different. End of quote. That is a kind of breakthrough in Hollywood movies by acknowledging the legitimacy of difference and basically begins to end the very momentum that had begun in the 1920s. It was extending through the 1950s. It was all in behalf of integration, all in behalf of assimilation, all in behalf, in effect, of the repudiation of Jewish life and of a distinctive Jewish identity and of Jewish continuity. So 1960 starts that process, and we can date 1960 for an indication in which Yiddish also becomes now in movies that had not existed in the 1920s or 1930s or 1940s or even 1950s. You may have seen or remember a movie called The Apartment, Billy Wilder, in which at the very end of the movie, Jack Lemmon is trying to tell Shirley MacLaine what he's always wanted to be. And Jack Lemmon says, all I wanted to be was just a mensch. And immediately after saying that, Jack Lemmon has to tell Shirley MacLaine, and of course the audience, what a mensch is. So in 1960, the general audience could not be assumed to know what a mensch is. Go up to 1974, a comic western called Blazing Saddles. There's a key moment, of course, in Blazing Saddles, a moment that every Jew who's ever seen it will never forget, in which Mel Brooks, dressed as an Indian, astride a horse, suddenly spouts Yiddish. Very, very strikingly. It's a moment that comes entirely out of nowhere. There's no provocation, there's no antecedent. It's a striking, striking moment in American movies, untranslated, of course, in any way. And I was once giving a lecture in which I happened to mention Blazing Saddles. And a woman came up to me after the lecture and said that she had seen Blazing Saddles in a non-Jewish neighborhood. And that when that scene appeared, of course, she breaks out into uncontrollable laughter. And when her laughter died down, a woman who was seated one aisle above turns to her and says, how lucky you are that you can understand the Indian language. That leads me to what Marcia said is now also my responsibility, which is to talk about Jewish comedy. It's an incredibly complicated topic. It's a topic that, again, like movies, suggests a kind of disproportionate Jewish influence. Around 1980, the New York Times estimated that 80% of stand-up comedians were of Jewish background, and noted that this is, in fact, a dramatic decline. Because 15 years earlier, 95% of stand-up comedians were alleged to be of Jewish origin. It's an amazing phenomenon, and it's also an international phenomenon. Jackie Mason took his Borscht Belt stand-up shtick to London so many times, 7 different times Jackie Mason did his act in London, so that Mason said he was there so often that, now I'm quoting him, the Queen of England was beginning to talk like me. To which I can only add, God save the Queen. And in both the internationalization and in terms of the impact in the United States, there is indeed something very, very striking about the Jewish role in humor and comedy. And because of the brevity of my part of the program this afternoon, I'd like to mention only one feature, although there are many features that might be mentioned. And that is the way in which Jewish humor really changes the very character of American humor. In the 19th century, the standard, or let's say the most authentic kind of American humor was known as Southwestern humor. It didn't mean what we mean by the Southwest, it's more like the Mississippi River Valley. And Southwestern humor, which was associated with figures like the flat boatman Mike Fink, associated with Davy Crockett, associated with a number of figures that we associate with frontier humor. This was a humor, above all, that has to be characterized as sadism. This was a humor that made fun of the weak, the vulnerable, and the helpless. This was a humor that thought it was funny to make jokes about Native Americans, about African American slaves, about killing animals. This was a humor that reveled in a kind of cruelty. And this was a humor that reveled in a kind of extreme masculinity or machismo, in which the humor was basically derived by taking pleasure in ensuring that the weak would submit to the strong. This was a humor that achieves a certain kind of culmination in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is a novel that both summarizes in various ways that kind of humor and also is the strongest objection to that kind of humor. If you haven't looked at The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn at all lately, I can only note that that is a novel that is awash in corpses. Even though it's supposed to be a very funny novel, and it is, there's a stench of death about it. And in much of that movie, in much of that novel, Huck Finn, in his own particular innocent way, is also showing the various ways by which human beings can be cruel to one another. So Twain knew this kind of humor very well, but he also offers the most powerful critique of that kind of humor. And if I have to generalize very, very simply before the question-answer period, one could say that what Jewish comedians do in the 20th century is to utterly upend that and emphasize a humor which valorizes and even, in a sense, exalts weakness and victimization. It is a humor that we often associate with what is called self-deprecation, in which what Jewish comedians do is basically turn themselves into objects of ridicule, turn themselves into objects of mockery, and thus emphasize, in a sense, their own vulnerability, and in that way really contradict the 19th century tradition of Southwestern humor. The first clear example of that is somebody, again, who Marcia not only mentioned, but also showed a couple of pictures in her PowerPoint presentation, and that is Jack Benny. Jack Benny ought to be considered a kind of revolutionary figure in radio comedy, called the Robespierre of radio comedy. Because what he basically did in a show that was called The Jack Benny Show was to make himself into the object of comedy. Not making fun of others on his show, although he occasionally did that, but allowing others to make fun of him, even though he was the topic matter. The most striking case of all, which so many people remember from The Jack Benny Show, first on radio and then on television, was of course the way he allowed his black chauffeur, known as Rochester, played by Eddie Anderson, to make fun of Jack Benny. And again, when you consider when this was done, when you consider the degree to which white racism which permeated American culture in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, it nevertheless was challenged by a program in which the black chauffeur is able to make fun and get away with it, making fun of his own employer. This was a striking moment in altering, in some ways, all sorts of racial attitudes, and allowed Jack Benny to present himself as the victim. But there's also something that continues within stand-up comedy, perhaps more generally. Woody Allen would be perhaps the most striking case of the stand-up comedy act in the 1960s, in which he emphasized weakness and a kind of puniness. Woody Allen's grandfather was so insignificant a figure, Woody Allen recalled, that at his grandfather's funeral, the hearse followed the other cars to the cemetery. And Woody Allen's father had so modest a job that Woody Allen's father was a caddy at a miniature golf course. He was very, very puny when he was a child. His parents sent him to an interfaith camp where Woody Allen remembers being beaten up by boys of every race, creed, and color. And when he managed to get back to Brooklyn, he was walking on the streets of Brooklyn one day, and Woody Allen was once even beaten up by Quakers. The other figure who does that, of course, most strikingly, was Rodney Dangerfield, whose real name was Jack Cohen. And of course, he had a whole tradition of that kind of self-deprecating humor in which he gets no respect. Rodney Dangerfield, as a child, was taken by his parents to a beach. He lost them. He goes to a policeman, and they look for his parents, and Dangerfield asks the cop whether they'll ever find them. The cop says, "I don't know, there's so many places to hide." A traumatic childhood like this inevitably led Rodney Dangerfield to see a psychiatrist. And after a couple of sessions, the psychiatrist tells Dangerfield, "Rodney, you're crazy." Dangerfield says, "Doc, I want a second opinion." The psychiatrist says, "Okay, you're ugly too." So ugly, in fact, that Rodney Dangerfield was forced to lie down on the couch face down. Psychiatry didn't quite work, so at one point Dangerfield calls the suicide prevention hotline, and they put him on hold. This is a kind of humor that, of course, need not be emphasized to an audience at the Jewish Museum of Florida. It has the deepest connections, of course, to Jewish history itself. Since we belong to a people that historically, outside the United States, of course, outside of Israel, has been a weak and vulnerable people. The striking thing about Jewish humor, the striking thing about Jewish comedy, along these lines, is something that, of course, connects to some of the deepest roots of the Jewish past itself. And that, therefore, Jewish comedy is something that can be appreciated, I hope, and understood in connection to the very character of the Jewish experience itself. Anyway, thank you very much. Bruce. And I do want to remind you, I only had a chance to really talk about one aspect of Jewish humor. But another aspect that you rightly note is that Jews have historically exempted themselves from what could be called gentility. So language, whether in the form of obscenity, whether in the form of profanity, language is something from which Jews have been less committed to obeying the rules of decorum that non-Jews have had. That is, you might want to say that as a minority that often historically was persecuted by the majority, Jews have often been willing to dissent from the canons and from the values and from the ideals of the majority. And often would tend to see the rules, including the rules of etiquette and the rules of proper speech, as something from which Jews need not subscribe. So the way in which Belle Barth, of course, who was also transgressive as a woman, that this was something that a certain kind of Jewish comedians would do. One of the odd things about humor is it's very difficult to know for sure what is funny. So that Albert Einstein, for example, liked to read Emily Post's book of etiquette, and he would cackle with delight because these things seem so strange to him, those particular ways by which the rules of gentility were obeyed. And I think Bruce and Barth would be certainly within that category. Very good.
Al Jolson was married to Ruby Hill, you're aware of it. And last night on TCN, there are two pictures of Ruby Hill. One, the Gold Digger of 1933, and the other picture was James Cagney, also in 1933. Now, James Cagney grew up in the East Side. He was not Jewish, but he spoke Yiddish fluently. And it was a picture that he made where he was sitting in the cab, and he reaches out, looks at the cab, and speaks to a vendor in Yiddish, mind you. And on the bottom they had the subtitles of what he said in Yiddish. James Cagney, sometime 1930s. But he grew up in the Lower East Side. James Cagney and Dave Sarno went to the same high school. They went to Stuyvesant High School in New York City. James Cagney was a brilliant man, and he went to Columbia for a short period of time, and then he went out to Hollywood as a hooper. But it was interesting. That movie Kill was in two movies last night, and Al Jolson was married to him.
Yeah, that's a good correction. There would be very occasionally Yiddish, and I probably should have not said there was no Yiddish. But again, it's interesting that an Irish-American actor would be using the Yiddish in a way that the character playing a Jew probably would not be. There's one Marx Brothers movie in which Groucho Marx uses the word schnorrer, but it's an extremely rare, very, very rare case. I also want to point out that Yiddish becomes performative. That is, it's not just that we shouldn't think that there was some authentic baseline of Yiddishkeit that is genuine from which the rest of us have strayed over generations. Molly Picon had to go to Europe in order to make sure that her Yiddish accent was still strong enough to be in sound films. Gertrude Berg, who had an Ivy League education from Columbia, did not speak at all with a Jewish or Yiddish accent. This was all performed. Yeah.
The greatest Jewish performance in Yiddish theater was Misha Auer. And Misha Auer was not Jewish. He was not Jewish. But also, I don't believe Oscar Hammerstein was Jewish either. I'm pretty sure he was not. They say he was not Jewish. Richard Martin was Jewish, but not Oscar Hammerstein.
No, Hammerstein's father was, but his mother was not.
The reason I know that Misha Auer was not Jewish because I live in New York City. My firm I worked for was the accountant for Misha Auer's son. He was a stockbroker, and he told us his father was not Jewish. I'm pretty sure.
Not every opinion stated here is necessarily that of the management. I didn't know that. But there are a number of cases here, I should add, in which people were assumed to be Jewish who were not, and it's a very good point. My favorite example is actually from the world of boxing, because Max Baer, who wore a Star of David on his trunks, was actually not Jewish. And reporters knew that because he was training for a fight against Primo Carnera. And he was training on the Day of Atonement. And reporters asked Max Baer, what are you doing this for? What about Yom Kippur? And Max Baer says, I'll fight him next.
America didn't enter the war against Germany until several days after December 7th, because it was a declared war on us. Okay. So prior to December 7th, America had full diplomatic relations with Germany. So the American government informed the Hollywood moguls not to make any film that would show Germany not in a bad light, would reveal any of the cruelties or discrimination, because that would interfere with American and German relations at that time. And the Nobels complied. So I wanted to ask you if you can comment, is that correct?
Everybody heard the question. The question had to do with the United States having full diplomatic relations with Germany until shortly after Pearl Harbor, and whether the American government then asked the American movie industry,
Not asked.
told them not to show movies that depict Germany in a bad light. It's a very complicated story, and it's fair to say that the United States would have been in a terrible bind had Hitler not declared war on the United States. Everybody knows that on December 8th, 1941, President Roosevelt asked the Joint Session of Congress only for a declaration of war against Japan. One of the great historical mysteries, which so far had never been resolved, is why Hitler, over the advice of his own general staff, on his own, without any treaty obligation to Japan, nevertheless declared war on the United States and therefore, in effect, dooming the military defeat of the Third Reich. But it's a more complicated story earlier basically for two reasons. Number one is that the Motion Picture Production Code, which went into effect in 1934, had all sorts of very clear rules about what could be seen on movie screens in order to get the Motion Picture Production Code. It had all sorts of rules, what you could show in terms of sexual relations, what you could show, for example, in terms of racial relations. And one of the rules was that you could not depict any nation or any group in a way that would not be considered fair. That was the adjective, fair. Now, fair, of course, does not necessarily mean sympathetic. But basically, it was interpreted for most of the 1930s as a requirement that you could not show Germany in an unfavorable light, because the German consul in Los Angeles, the German consul in New York, would make protests to the Motion Picture Production Code sponsors, and that there would be all sorts of diplomatic consequences. So it's not so much the American government, so much as the rules of the movie industry itself. They needed the seal in order to get their movies exhibited in most American movie theaters, not all, but nearly all. And therefore, they interpreted that part of the code as making it impossible for them to show movies that could be depicted as anti-Nazi, for example. The other factor was that Hollywood wanted to show its movies abroad, including in Germany. Unless they could show movies in Germany, the only way they could do that was presumably not reciprocated. So in that sense, there was a terrible bind that should be done. I can only add very, very briefly, a similar problem was faced by the New York Times. Adolph Oakes, who grew up in a German-speaking home in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and becomes the publisher of the New York Times in 1896, had very great fondness for German culture. And he was horrified when Hitler took power in 1933. And he forbade in the New York Times, until his death, which was 2 years later, he forbade any letters to the editor that would be critical of the Third Reich. And he did so on the basis that the New York Times, which had a kind of fetish about fairness, if you publish anti-Nazi letters in the New York Times, we're going to have to publish pro-Nazi letters in the New York Times. And therefore, the decision made, as long as Oakes was publisher, was we're not going to publish any letters that might show the third light and the critical light. It was a terrible, terrible line. They were following their own particular rules, not being fully cognizant of how utterly unprecedented Nazi totalitarianism would be.
A lot of the humor is many times pointed at the Jewish woman, the Jewish mother in her hovering mode, or the Jewish mother with a father who's very weak and she tells him what to do. And that's a lot of the humor. This woman went to the cemetery to see the grave of her husband, Irving Goldberg, and they couldn't find it. They said, there's only an Ida Goldberg. She said, that's it, everything's in my name.
JLTV, which is Jewish Life Television, but to this day we can see Jack Benny and Molly Goldberg as it appeared in the late 40s and early 50s, and it's just wonderful. It's in black and white, of course. Wonderful.